Hello, Global Game Jam New York. My name is Louis Cataldi, and I'm an evangelist for the Quixel team, which is part of Epic Games. Today, I'll be doing a presentation on Quixel Mixer, which is available for download from Quixel.com. Now, Quixel Mixer is a very powerful and procedural toolset for accessing over 14,000 Megascan assets, both 2D and 3D, and allows you to modify these to create textures both very photorealistic but also very stylized. This can be really powerful in a game jam context. Let's dig in and take a look at how this works. All right, here we are in Quixel Mixer. And as you can see, I've got a viewport. And typically when you start out Quixel Mixer, you can create a brand new project or a new mix. And we can call this my demo mix. And I'm going to call this my demo mix 5 because I'm sure I've got a number of other. Actually, let's call it something like my global game jam mix. And that'll be better. And I won't save the changes to the current. And it starts out with a flat plane in front of you here, and I can use my mouse wheel to scroll in and out, and I can hold down my Alt key and start panning around. And then I'm in my Setup tab, which is over here on the top right, and if I hit my Control key, you'll see that my mouse gets this little circle around it, so you can see where my mouse is at all times. I can change my working resolution from 256 to 512 to 1K to 4K to 8K, and I'm going to stay at 4K. So I have some nice resolution. Now I can continue to work on this 2D plane, but I'm going to actually switch over to a 3D asset. Now I can also bring in custom meshes through FBX files or can work with a shader ball. But I'm going to switch over to 3D, and this allows me to access my local library over here in the top right. The top left. Now these are 3D models that I've already brought in from the Quixel library. And you can see that I have full access to these things. But let me show you that I can also go online. And this gives me access to the full Quixel Mixer online library. Actually, this is the Megascans library, I should say. And this is all broken down by a variety of different categories. I have surfaces, I've got brushes, atlases, and 3D. And once again, when I go to the category of 3D, I can look at different things like bricks, and these are all different types of building surfaces that I can see. I've got different kinds of busts that I can access, concrete, debris, edibles. So, if you want to bring in some food type things, and it's really quite impressive. Different types of things from our library. You've got all kinds of different mosses, things from the ocean bottom, plastics, huge collections of rocks and so forth, rooftop elements, walls of different kinds, all kinds of street things, garbage, and a tremendous amount of stuff. Or you can look at all of it and browse it as you like. And then once again, I can look at large thumbnails, medium thumbnails, small, and so forth, depending on how you want to view your library. Now keep in mind that in order to access all this stuff, all you really need is an Epic ID. So an Epic ID is something that you create at unrealengine.com, or if you just search Google for creating an Epic ID, this is the same ID you use to access Unreal Engine, the same ID you use at the Epic Games launcher to get any kind of marketplace content or even play Fortnite. That Epic ID is the pathway to getting all of this content. Once you find something you like, you just, let's say I find something I like here. It could be anything. Let's pick something really quickly so you can see the way that you get it. I've already pulled a number of these down. Let's say I like one of these. And all I have to do is click on download and it begins to download. I don't really need this in particular, but let's say that I did. Then it will show up here in my local library. And you can see I already have quite a few of these things already downloaded. And I'm going to pick something to work with. You can see we have this cool ham, which is kind of funny and ridiculous. But, for the sake of context for the Global Game Jam, I'm going to pick this Japanese stone lantern, which is kind of a really nice, beautiful asset. And what it does is it brings it into Quixel Mixer, and here it is in my viewport. Now I'm holding down my my Alt key, and I'm using my left mouse button to sort of pan around it. Pretty typical viewport manipulation. And then I can hold down my middle mouse and pan it around the scene. And then if I hold down the Shift key and I use my right mouse button, I can actually move the light around the scene. So if I want to use my mouse wheel to zoom in and out, I can sort of see what kind of detail this photogrammetry, okay, the words will come out, photogrammetrically scanned asset actually has on it. So you can see it's beautifully scanned, has a tremendous amount of detail. Now, you can use something like this completely as is, or maybe you actually want to stylize it a fair amount for your game. And I'm going to show you how to use some of the tools in here to stylize something like this, but also create a template for being able to stylize a great many other assets. So right now we're still in the Setup tab. I'm going to switch over to the Layer tab, and I can do that over here in the top right just by clicking on my layers. And you can see that right now my current layer is the Japanese stone lantern. And to the right of that are all the different components that I can work with. So currently I've got the albedo layer, which is of course the surface representation of the texture, and also the metalness layer if there's any metallic elements. This is where I would control that. I've got the roughness, which is the surface details aside from the albedo. The albedo generally represents the color tones, and the roughness represents the surface perturbance, what's shiny and what's not. We're working with a physically based rendering approach here, which is a roughness based approach and not a specular based approach. We've got displacement. We also have normal. Now, in a situation here where I would want to turn this into a more stylized asset, I might actually want to reduce the amount of normal information, because something like that would be a bit distracting, especially with all this moss. So I'm actually going to reduce the strength of this normal information on this base asset so that it becomes a little less distracting, and it'll become a little bit more apparent. So I'm going to actually click now on this solid layer and give it a bit of a gray overtone to it. And what I did is I created a new solid layer, and we've got a set of tools above here, layer tools. I can add a surface to it, I can add decals and atlases, but I can also add a solid layer. So I just created a new solid layer, and I'm going to use this as a base color layer. So I'm going to call it base color. And you can see just by the way that just increasing the normal, I went back to the original layer, I can increase and decrease the normal, how much influence that normal has on this. So that's an easier way to look at it. I'll go back to the base color layer. And now what I want to do is sort of catch some highlights on this asset so that, in the context of making it even perhaps cartoony, I may want to be able to catch some edge color for it. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and add another solid layer, and I'm going to change the albedo color of the solid layer to something fairly bright, maybe even full-on white. And I can do that once again by clicking on the little round ball here, the color selector, and changing that to fairly full-on white. And in order to access the procedural stack, to be able to isolate the edges on this mesh, I'm going to come down to the bottom down here and add what's known as a mask stack. When I do that, very similar once again to Photoshop, you see that a mask stack has been created, and now I've got some tools up here that I can access. And I've got what's known as an add a mask component, and then I also have add mask modifiers. So I'm going to go to the component section, and I'm going to come down here to curvature, and I'm going to add what's known as a curvature component, mask component to it. And, you know, immediately you don't see anything in this particular view mode. But if I come back up here to the top left, you notice that I'm in what's known as PBR mode. But if I click on it, I can view my viewport in a variety of different ways. I can look at it in pure albedo. I can view a normal roughness, but I can also go into my layer mask mode. And my layer mask mode shows me what this mask is doing. And you can see that my mask, my curvature component here, allows me to actually modify the levels. And the other thing that it gives me options for is how I apply this curvature mask. So right now it's in default curvature, but I can actually tell it to show me the edges only. And the moment I do that, it really starts to highlight the edges of this mesh. And the other thing that I can do is come down here to these levels and start to really pull out just the edges of that mesh. And then I've got a tightness control here, which really allows me to tighten those edges really well. And now if I hit the 1 key, because all of these are tied to my number keys on my keyboard, it takes me back to PBR mode. And you can see that right away, I found all the outer edges of my mesh. Now that's super amazing and powerful, because I went from, and I can turn the eyeball off next to this layer, and this was the flat gray layer, and now I've just turned on those edges. Now this can be completely up to you. If you want to continue to modify this layer, maybe this grain is a little distracting to you, and there's a couple of ways to soften this if you choose to do so. I can go back into the mask, I can go to the curvature, and if I want to, I can go in and give it a little bit of Gaussian blur. Now by default Gaussian blur comes in at 0.1, but I can put a 0.01, and it just gives it a little bit of blur, and that's completely up to you. I like a little bit of blur. I might even put a 0.006. So I retain a little bit of that, but not too much. And that looks kind of interesting to me. Cool. So I've got my edges selected, and I can use my Shift right mouse button to see what else is going on there. And now I'm going to go ahead and add another solid layer, because I found the outer edges, but I might also like to find the inner edges. And this time I'm going to turn the albedo by using the color selector to go full on black. And I'll go ahead and add another mask stack. And I'll use the same tool by going into the Add Mask component and use the curvature tool again. And this time I'm going to hit 9 on my keyboard, which once again takes me to the layer mask. And instead of using default curvature or edges only, this time I'm going to go to cavities only. And this basically, instead of finding the outer edge, it's going to find all the stuff on the inside. So now as I come down here and play with levels, you can see that it starts to find all the inside stuff. And this can be really kind of interesting and cool as well. And I can really pull the levels in, and be mindful that once you pull the levels in as much as you want, you can hold down the Shift key on your keyboard and you can drive both the top and bottom bars on those levels yourself. Now if I hit 1 on the keyboard, you can see that it really starts to pop this 3D model. And once again, it's up to you whether you choose to add a little bit of blur to that. And I can give it a little Gaussian blur. And once again, 0.0065. Add some really interesting tone variation to it. But you've got a couple of other options here too as well. You can add some brightness and contrast. Maybe you want a little bit of additional contrast to that, and you can see that that really makes it super interesting and starts to give it a little bit of interesting cartooniness to it. And there's some other options in here as well. I can take this and start to play around with it a little bit more. Another interesting tool is this polarize tool. I can come in here and give it a little bit of extra polarization, and you might not see too much of that depending on what you're doing, but it starts to give it some really interesting color values. So you can see that very quickly I've given this some really interesting look compared to what it was. And once again, similar to Photoshop, if I hold down my Alt key and click on an eyeball, it hides all the other layers. So this is what it originally looked like, and this is what it looks like now. Now what's really kind of interesting is that I can go back to that base color and change the albedo. So if I want to give it maybe this light blue color, you can see that it's kind of really interesting what look that I can generate for an asset like this. Now I'm going to give it one more layer, and we might be done with this particular workflow for now. And I'm going to give it at the very top here another solid layer, and I'm going to make it a little bit darker by changing once again the base color, maybe something a little more grounding, like, you know, a dark grounding color, like a dark green or something like that. And once again, I'll add another mask stack to it. And this time I'm going to add what's known as a position gradient. And once again, if I hit my 9 key and I go to the layer mask, you can see that it gives you a top to bottom gradient. And I'm going to go over here to the position gradient, and I can actually invert that by saying, instead of coming from above, let's go from below. And what that's going to do is, if I go now back, it gives it a little bit of a grounding tone. And I know that looks a little bit harsh now, but if I hit the 9 key on the keyboard, I can choose to modify where this starts by changing the range slider. So maybe I want that gradient to come a little higher or lower. And now I'll go back to the actual layer, and here in the albedo, I can open up that albedo and I can change the way that it's being applied, right? So right now it's just doing a basic overlay with normal, but I can actually say, well, I want it to multiply that over top of it, or I want it to do an actual overlay effect. And you can see that it changes the way that it applies it, or I want it to do maybe a divide, right? And so you can see that you can do and change the opacity of it. So you can do some really interesting stuff. That's really grotesque. Let's go back to multiply. And you can just give it a little bit of a grounding element with maybe some tiny added contrast. And I might go back to the mask stack, change the range slider, and this is another place where I can go back and add a little bit of brightness and contrast, and just play around with how it's influencing the whole, just to give it a little bit of additional grounding. And once again, since this is all very non-destructive, I can go in and say, well, maybe that's too much of one color or another, or I want to manipulate how the color is working all together. Now, let's get into the next part of this. Once again, your base color can evolve any way you want, but keep in mind that I can now select all of these, and what I'm going to do here is just name these so that I know what I'm doing. So this is my outer edges, and this is my, what is this? This is my cavity, and this is my grounding. Now once I've got everything named, all my layers, I can select them all and put them all into a group. And I'm going to call this, rename it, my new global game jam tune. And the final thing I'm going to do is export it as a smart material. And I'll call it my new Global Game Jam tune and say export. So that allows me to save this as its own material. But here's what's really powerful about all this. Now I can go into the setup, and let's say I've created one. Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's say I like everything I've done here, and I'm getting ready to save it out and export it as, a texture that I can use on this asset. But before I do, I want to see what it looks like on maybe another asset. So I can come here and say, well, let's see how this looks like on this Japanese statue. Well, I can go and just select a completely different mesh and apply this to it and go, wow, that looks pretty good. That'll work out well. But this is completely non-destructive because I've saved this out as a smart material. So I can now go in and change the parameters and say, well, on this one, I want it to be a little more, a little less, and maybe my cavities need a little bit less contrast, or a little bit more contrast, or I've got the blur or polarization needs to be a little bit more or less. So keep in mind that this stack and all of this procedural stuff that you're doing here is completely modifiable. And you can alter it in any way that you want. Maybe too much grunging, or you need a little bit more grounding, or any of that stuff. And once you're happy with all this work that you're doing, you just come over here to the Export tab and choose the textures you want to export to Unreal Engine. So maybe I don't need albedo, I just want a diffuse texture. Maybe you're not going to use specular, but you're going to use roughness. Your normal, I don't need displacement. Maybe I need some AO. And you choose your working resolution. 4K may be too big. Maybe you only need 512 or 1024 or 2K. Create a folder, so forth and so on. And you say, I want to export these maps. And bang, it's going to export them for you. Now here's what's really powerful and really cool. Let's say I create a new mix. All right, so we'll go ahead and do a save as on this one, and we're going to call this my Global Game Jam Mix 2 or whatever. And I'm going to make a brand new mix. And we'll call this my all new Global Game Jam Mix. And this time I'm going to bring in another 3D asset. Maybe it's this fire hydrant. I haven't tried this before, so I don't know what this is going to look like. And let's go to the layer stack. And I don't remember how I created the last one, right? So I can come up here, and instead of creating a solid layer, I can go and look for a surface. And if I go to my categories in my local library, remember I just saved out that smart material. So here on the bottom, I can find that smart material, and you can see that here, my new Global Game Jam tune is available to me, and there it is. I can bring it in, and all of it is still right there. So I can always at any time access that, and surprisingly enough, it looks kind of interesting and decent on this fire hydrant. But once again, the full procedural stack is here. So if I want to change the base color and say I don't really want to work with blue, I want to work with, something a little bit more red or green or brown, whatever the case is, you can change any of these variables and continue to work with them. So that is pretty awesome, pretty cool. Final thing I want to leave you with here is that there are literally hundreds of smart materials that you can work with. So maybe you don't want to create your own. You can select it and you can delete it. Maybe you want to come in and say, let's add another surface, and I'm going to go find a different smart material to work with. And I'm going to actually make my thumbnails medium size, because look at all these smart materials. And all you have to do is put your mouse over top of them and say, insulated foil or dirty rusted metal. And there's some really gorgeous, and these are all procedural, and the whole procedural stack is available to you. Let me show you some that I think are kind of cool. There was a really nice couple of wood ones that I thought were really nice. This is old painted wood. So this is already a white metallic fire hydrant, but you can see this is going to come in as painted wood, and it applies it right on top of it. And look, all of a sudden you've got this painted wood fire hydrant, and you can see that the procedural stack is here. So you've got, and one of the nice ways to actually learn Mixer is to go through and see how the artists and technical artists at Quixel have created these smart materials. And remember, I told you that if you hold down the Alt key, you can isolate each one of these layers. So I've isolated the plywood layer, and then you can isolate a paint layer. But you can also, once again, select a mask stack and hit the 9 key and sort of see, well, what is this mask doing? All right, well, what is this mask doing? Oh, that's where my scratches are coming in. Oh, what is this mask doing? Oh, that's where all the grunges are coming in. And what's that mask doing? Okay, that's doing. So this is a really powerful way to sort of select a mask stack and see that, oh yeah, well, they're doing the same thing we did a few minutes ago. There's a curvature, and then they're using a position gradient. And this is really cool. They're using a map, which is an old varnish map, and then a separate map, and they're multiplying the effects of those together and then overlaying them on top. So, you know, as you start to study what's going on with this procedural stack, you'll discover that in many ways it's more and more like Photoshop than you might know. And for those of you who know Photoshop, it'll start to make a lot of sense. So I strongly encourage you, especially when you find some of these crazy cool smart materials, to sort of dig in and say, well, wow, how do they create this old brass? And open it up, bring it into one of these 3D assets, and take a look at it and go, look at that. Shine your light around it. And the other thing too is that you can also create layers that sit on top of these. So if maybe this is a good starting point for you, you can always create a solid material on top of it. Keep this in mind as well. Create a mask stack where you find the edges or something and tunify something here. So you can also, you know, find your edges for something like this. Get your cavities or maybe your edges. Maybe something to that effect. Go back out. And remember that you can always come back to this base material and apply that as a multiply on top of it. So, or an overlay or something, you know, an add. And you can get some really interesting stuff. So it's just a matter of isolating and isolating and isolating. And you can do that through gradient remaps, clamps, contrast, and so forth. So really incredibly powerful tool set. I strongly encourage you to play around with it, get to know it. There's some very powerful tools in here that allow you to do some amazing stuff and get to work with some really gorgeous textures, 3D assets that have been scanned at the highest level. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Once again, with the context of a global game jam, Global Game Jam as a rule does not require you to make everything that you use in it. Now, be mindful of your own site. Maybe there are some rules wherever you are. I don't believe New York requires you to make everything. So this adds, once again, over 14,000 things that you can utilize. And once again, being able to use a procedural stack like this to modify both 2D and 3D assets is a huge game changer. So I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you all have a great and wonderful Global Game Jam. And thank you once again. My name is Louis Cataldi. I'm an evangelist for the Quixel team, which is part of Epic Games. And take care of yourself, and I hope to see you in the future.